if you take all the eggs of a fish, several thousand of eggs, the maximum is in the sunfish, it's 3 million eggs per female. 3 million eggs per female. Can you imagine that? If you take the eggs and you put these eggs in an aquarium, protected from any predator, you look at the development of the fishes from one set of egg. You see something like 40% of the developments that just going nowhere, because it's what we call in the past we called that monstrosity, you know, failed developments. 2 vertebral columns, 2 pelvic fins, 2 pelvic systems, deformation of the jaw, and so on. You have misformations of many parts of the body. So in nature, those kind of development are automatically and very rapidly eaten by the predators. So you don't see the failures. You see only the success. So you have the impression that there is a plan. But you have to keep in mind that what we see from nature is after an invisible symmetry. Okay, which helps to understand why you can have a construction without a plan. There is no plan, neither plan nor program. So it's really counterintuitive, I know that, but it's thinking as an evolutionist is fighting against our most primary intellectual impulses, if I can say. Okay, should we start or? This idea is very old. The first one about history of science. I really like the writings of Pierre-Louis Moreau de Maupertuis. Maupertuis is a physicist. He wrote a book in 1751 where he explained that maybe the fact that living things seems to function properly, the fact that they are regular, it comes from a combination of organs, and only those combinations that make the individual able to reproduce itself is arriving to us. The rest the rest just die, and we don't see it. So, to my knowledge, he is the very first one who has this idea of regularity can come from a disorder, a fundamental physical and chemical disorder. By pruning individuals that have the unfavorable combination of characters. It's okay? About classification. Yes, we started by saying that there is a tension between the change of the biological world, the permanent change, and the necessity of stability for classification. Classification is first of all made for communication. It's made for being able to understand each other. This is the deepest reason of classification. It's always made for using the external world. Humans and maybe also primates have some classificatory systems that makes them able to exploit in a way resources from the environment. It's a basic example, you know that already. I mean, you are specifically encouraged to have good concepts for venomous animals or venomous plants if you don't want to be killed by venoms or toxic compounds. 80% of the plants around us produce toxic compounds. We are able to eat more than 10%, no, something like 10% of the botanical variation. Plants without toxic compounds that we are able to eat because we don't die from it, you know. So you have first of all, you have to have a good classification of what is a toxic plant and what is a good one for your health, to be able to exploit and to exploit the environment, to eat. So classification is a very basic need of our minds, first of all. I will trying to give you some elements for a scientific classification to be performant. Scientific classification, that is a classification that is made for helping us to collectively and rationally explain the real world. I'm not speaking about imaginary worlds. It's okay for me, but it's not the matter of science. If I'm looking at science, what makes a scientific classification a good one, an efficient one? So there are some parameters that, if we are in an interdisciplinary assembly here, I was thinking that looking at some properties of a scientific classification to be efficient will be interesting for biology, but also for geology, but also for astronomy, for ethnology, anthropology, and so on. There are some basics, I mean, for scientifications to be efficient, and I would like to invite you to consider these parameters. First of all, I would like to make the difference between three mental operations. And you know what? At the primary school, the recent changes for the kids when they go to classification, the main tools that are produced now are made for making this difference clear. Making the difference between the verb to separate. You have a sample of something here, and you separate the samples with a line, and this is what you are using when you sort out a diversity of objects. It is specifically used in identification keys. Identification keys, it's like a game, you know. You have a flower in your hand, and we ask, okay, do you have smooth leaves or rough leaves? If it's smooth, you go to page 31, and if you have rough leaves, you go to page 80. And page 80, you go, and another question is asked. You have 5 petals, or you have only 4. If you have 5, you go page 120, and if not, you go page. So it's a path where you orientate yourself to gain what? It's a game, so you gain something. You gain the name of a species. So it's an identification key through a hierarchy of questions. There is a kind of tree of decisions that is made to guide you to the name of a species. And the guy who produced the key has produced different operations of separations, successive operations of separations. They have this, they don't have this. There is no name to put on it. You are not trying to create boxes in your mind. You just need a path to be oriented. Is it clear? You don't create any concept in an ID key. Classification is more about to gather objects, gathering objects. And you gathering objects into a set. The definition of a set is a gathering of objects justified by at least one shared property. You have to justify the set by at least one common shared property. It seems to be easy to distinguish, but trust me, for kids or for adults, it's not so easy to distinguish, because we humans need to name. It's It's a really spontaneous reflex. We need to name things. So if you do this, if you separate a sample, you are spontaneously inclined to say, okay, here we have people living in Paris, and here you have people that don't live in Paris. You have the suburbs here. Suburbans, Parisians. Les provinciaux, tiens, je ne sais pas comment on dit en anglais, les provinciaux. How many of you live in province? Raise your hand. Hello, les provinciaux. Provincials, would it be good in English? I don't know, but it's a very French distinction, you know, because France is a very centralized country. So you have people who live in Paris and the rest. And so when you put a name on the rest, you feel immediately that the rest is named not because of its own property. It's named because it's excluded from the other category. If you put a name here, if I say, okay, here you have corners, and here there is no corners. Here, it's a circle. If I put a name on this one won't be named. You create a set in your mind. And this set is not justified by a property. It's justified by its exclusion from the neighboring group. Is it clear? So, as soon as you name what is at the right or at the left of a separating line, you're doing a mistake. We did it in the past when we created invertebrates. You have heard about invertebrates. When you say invertebrates, you speak about animals that don't have vertebra. It's weird, don't you think? How can you justify the grouping of animals on the basis of what they don't have? Okay, I realize that you understand. It's stupid. If you take a snail or a worm, and you group a snail and a worm on the basis of it doesn't have any vertebra, you don't speak about them. You speak about the human. So, in the history of science, there was a time where we produced anthropocentric classifications. It worst to put in a group animals that didn't have what the human have, because human was central in the cosmogony of the time. But it made sense at that time, it made sense to group animals on the basis of what they didn't have, because human was central in the system. But if you export this historical epiphenomenon, if you transport this in another field, it's obviously immediately looks like stupid. I mean, I can have a pair of glasses, a sheet of paper, a wheel of a car. I put them into a set, and I say that they don't have any feathers. You can construct any stupid set of objects if you allow yourself to define a set according to an absence of property. So, going back to here, there is a spontaneous risk of naming what is on the left or on the right of this separating line here. If the mental action is to separate, don't name what is separated. Trust me. As a systematist, I could see many examples of historical examples of what we did about that. Here, if you are clear about classification, you will justify the sets by characters shared by the content. And the third one is just to assign. The sets are already available. You are not creating sets, you are just using sets. They are already available, and you just put an object to the right box according to its property. It's just like when you clean your room, you're just doing that without thinking about that, but you are doing that. Range ta chambre, clean your room. Sorry for the English. Unfortunately, in natural history, it's an example of source of confusion. Unfortunately, maybe not elsewhere, but in natural history, we were some factors of confusion about the operation of separations or operation of gathering. The source of confusion was the mathematical tool used to produce a hierarchy of decision was the same one as the one used to produce a hierarchy of sharings. It's a hierarchical tool. We call that a tree. It's not a good name. The good name is oriented connected graph. Non-cyclical connected graph. It's a graph, obviously. Non-cyclic because there is a single path from one tip to another tip, a single path. And oriented because there is a beginning here and the end here. This kind of tool is producing hierarchies. Those questions are more general than those questions that are more specific. This is in that way we understand hierarchy. This kind of mathematical tool are very useful to produce a hierarchy of questions. The ID key I spoke about a few minutes ago. So you produce a hierarchy of exclusions as well as a hierarchy of sharings here. You are not trying to explain the world. It's just a pragmatic tool to get a name at the end. Here, the same mathematical tool is used, but in a very different epistemological context. You need to make a hierarchy of shared characters because you are producing a classification based on common ancestry. You are explaining the world here. You are not explaining the world there. The two very different epistemological worlds. Here, there is a long history explaining why we decided in the middle of the 19th century, why in the middle of the 19th century we decided to create groups of classification to reflect genealogy, to reflect common ancestors. What are the signs you have received from your common ancestors? They have disappeared. They don't send any email or any SMS, So they have completely disappeared. So for Darwin, the best way to have a reflection of the disappeared ancestors is what they have transmitted to their offspring. So this is the reason why we classify according to what organisms have in common, because we suppose that what they have in common is the heritage of their common ancestor. This is the reason why we classify on what they have and not on what they do, or not on where they live, or not on how I use it. This is not the objective, the goal. The goal is to have a classification that reflects genealogy. By saying that, you understand that I have a very strong ontological reasoning. I mean, classification is part of the explanation of nature. An ID key is not part of any explanation at all. An ID key is made just to drive you into a complexity. Is it clear? Okay, if it's clear. But because these figures were used, there were some degree of confusions, even in the school programs. In school programs, they use ID keys and they put as a title classification. They call that classification. And it was not clear either in teachers' minds. The confusion was still in teachers' mind also. So there was a need for some change there. So if we have left apart the possible confusions between this operation and this one, if it's clear that it's different operations, let's go on this one. You tend to increase the richness of the information contained in a classification by nested sets, a hierarchy of nested sets. I'm taking an example about biodiversity. One time I was teaching to teachers of Guyana, French Guyana, and they received a pedagogical paper of some ecological association that if you go to the forest, there is a good pedagogy to do into the forest from the Guyana. Okay, let's do classification by kids. If there are some fur at the surface of the animal, it's a mammal. If there are some scales, it's a reptile. If you have feathers, it's a bird. If there is nothing, it's an amphibian. And they call that classification. Indeed, it is a kind of using classification, but it's a poor classification. And why is it poor classification? Just like the table of elements of Mendeleev's, you have sets of objects that are neighbors to each other, but they are not nested into each other. Just neighbors, you know, not nested. Let's go back to my example. A kid made a remark. He said, "Okay, there are feathers. I put this animal in the birds, but it's weird. They are so scarce in the legs. So what should I do with the scales here? If you do I put the bird in birds or here?" And the question was raising the interest of nested hierarchy. The kid realized that the box bird should be within the box reptile, because birds do have scales in their legs. Just have a look, you'll see. So, indeed, we need if we want to be close to the observation, we need to have a nested set here. But by having nested sets, you open the possibility to be confronted to sets of shared properties. Some properties are widely shared, while into that box, other properties are shared by a fewer number of individuals. We will not maximize the possibility we will not maximize information with a piling hierarchy. A piling hierarchy is putting boxes onto each other. And there are some loss of information when you're doing that. Let me give you an example. You have heard about periods of prehistory: Paleolithics, Mesolithics, and Neolithics. If I define Paleolithic by the birth of stone tools, Neolithics is defined by the beginning of agriculture or the beginning of war. If you don't put Neolithics into Paleolithics, you act as if there wouldn't be any stone tools in the Neolithics. Here I am in the Neolithics, in another box, but the stone tools are still there. So the box should be put in that one. Time hierarchies should be nested hierarchies in order not to lose information. If I leave Neolithics outside Paleolithics, I'm losing the information that there are still stone tools in the Neolithics. Okay, so piling hierarchies, in a way, is losing information in certain circumstances. Information that you will save when using a nested hierarchy. Piling hierarchies we have many of them in the history of natural history, obviously. Aristotle scale, we find it in the Middle Age through this illustration here from the 14th century, where you have a piling hierarchy of beings until the paradise here. You have stones, fire, plants, animal, humans, angels, and after angels you have the paradise. It's a scale of value, obviously, because it's not really a scientific, it's a theological discourse, but you know, at that time the scientific and theological discourses were mixed in those times. You still find some of these piling hierarchies in Charles Bonnet's Natural History, 1745, when you have fire, air, water, earth, metals, stones, plants, insects, snakes, fishes, birds, mammals, and at the top there is the man. And in the text it is said that beyond the man there are angels, so we are still in the same representation of échelle de la nature, scala naturae, if you prefer. It's an illustration of what we call a piling hierarchy. Those steps of the scale are concepts, are classificatory concepts. So we are really into this kind of system. We are inclined to think that nested sets are more richer information, because when you have a supplementary property, it doesn't extract you from the previous set that gave you a more general property. I mean, in this kind of system, you don't have to choose between being an animal and being a human. You can be both. If animals are defined by the sharing of collagen in the tissue, you know, this long protein that is maintaining the consistency of your tissue. You are an animal because you have collagen. You are a human because you have parallel toes here, or you have articulating language. Being a human, you can be a human and be an animal at the same time. This property is more widely shared across biodiversity than this one. You don't have to choose, you can be both. You have more information, you know. Put in another way, you are in Neolithics here, you don't have to escape from Paleolithics. You still have stone tools here with nested sets. And another way to represent this kind of hierarchy is the graph, the oriented, non-cyclic connected graph. You can represent hierarchy of sets like this, but there is always possibility to represent hierarchy using these mathematical tools here. It's not because it looks like a tree that it is a phylogenetic tree. This kind of figure can be used to produce hierarchies on any kind of objects, non-evolving objects included. Put in another way, this kind of graphs are not necessarily phylogenies. You know, in the web, there is a huge confusion about the words. As soon as you see a kind of figure, people call that a phylogeny, but If this figure is used to classify cars or I don't know what, glasses, there is not necessarily evolution. You are just, there are other reasons to produce a hierarchy for those objects, not evolutionary ones. I mean, those kind of mathematical tools are used for many things. For life, obviously, for life, it is about evolution, but not necessarily for other objects. Okay. One of the obstacles we have in producing, not producing, but making classification understood, is that in our cultural heritage force us to consider our relationship with the rest of biodiversity through a cut here, or a break, if you prefer. The humans are instinctively and also culturally inclined to over-define himself. When you give something to chimpanzees that previously was restricted to humans, it's always pages and pages of papers in the media, you know. Chimpanzees make war, chimpanzees make negotiation, chimpanzees have some kind of vocabulary, and so on and so on. So what is the definition of the human? We are obsessed by the unicity of the human. But it's okay for that. But the problem is that this reflex is in a context where the humans considered himself as opposed to the rest of the biodiversity. The humankind is trying to over-define himself against an undefined animal. So this is not the way science works. And this kind of mental scheme, you have to choose between being a human or being an animal. And most of the people who will meet outside will say, we are not animals, we are not beasts, we are humans. And this mental reflex is like producing the rest of the world invertebrates, you know, those concepts that are the rest of the world. Concepts based on exclusion, not based on shared properties. So if you are a scientist, whatever the scientific field, try to pay attention to the false concepts, the concepts that are defined by the exclusion from something else. Invertebrates, okay, for me it's okay. For long ago we have identified that one. But in everyday life, not only in science, in everyday life you can consider world music, for instance. It's funny because when you look at the name, you feel that it is really inclusive. We are speaking about world music, music of the world. But if you look at the geometry of the concept, not the name, do you remember at the very beginning of the afternoon I made a difference between the name and the geometry of the concept? The name is world music, but it's confusion, it's a pitfall. You are not speaking about music of everyone in the world. The Rolling Stones are not classified in the world music in the shop. Beethoven or Mozart are not included in world music. World music is the music of the others. Non-industrial, non-occidental music. So it's a concept based on exclusion. Put it in another way, if the Chinese, for instance, would have defined musical categories, they would call us world music, you know, music of the others. Overseas is classical. I mean, overseas, extraterrestrials is funny. The Earth at the middle of the universe, and the others that are not in the Earth are called extraterrestrials. So all these peoples are self-centered. You have understood that. Those concepts are self-centered, and this is not really how we classify when we are scientists. We are trying to classify objects according to their real properties, not their position with regard to us. So in science, we don't produce cuts, we produce nested sets. And you are more precise by, if you want to understand what is the place of the humans in biodiversity, you are more precise if you use nested sets than if you're using cuts. Because nested sets will force you to define what is exclusive to you here. This set, I have parallel toes, I have articulated language, okay. I will be forced to be clear about what I am sharing with this neighbor here, and I also have to be clear with what I'm sharing with this Homo habilis, and I am also forced to be clear about what I'm sharing with this Ramapithecus, and so on. So you will gain in precision, you will gain in vocabulary, and you can be both an animal and a human, according to the scheme. So information richness is maximized with nested sets of sets, nested set hierarchy under the form of a nested set. We are trying to gain in not only in information richness but also in consistency by avoiding partially overlapping groups. If you have a scheme, classifying scheme like that, you will have hierarchical inconsistency. If you take part of a group, the yellow one here, and a part of another one, the blue one here, and these two parts, you create a group together. This is called a contradiction of this hierarchy here, or inconsistency of hierarchy. The most famous example I know is the French university system, where you take a team of the university, Sorbonne Université, you take a team of the museum, and we create an UMR, Unité Mixte de Recherche. A translation, a mixed unit of research. Mixed, by definition, mixed. Why mixed? Because I took a team from the university, I took a team, not all university, just a part. I took of the museum and I put it in the box. So when I'm here, I have two bosses. I have a box in my institution, and I have a boss here of the unit of research. It's complicated to be a researcher in France. Wow. You are not well paid, but you also are in an inconsistent organization, right? So we try to avoid inconsistency, and we have mathematical tools to measure. We call that consistency index. We have mathematical tools to measure the proportion of contradiction between sets, if there are some reasons to create that group here. We try to give to our classification a single purpose. It's a old philosophical problem. You will be inclined to wish to get a classification that speaks about everything. I would like to have a holistic classification that would speak about all the properties of the objects we have outside here. Trust me, it's really impossible, because you will have a huge amount of hierarchical inconsistency. If you want a consistency into your classification, so an efficient classification, a classification when it's consistent, it allows you to make some predictions about some properties you have not yet observed. So you need a consistent classification to have some predictive power of your classification. You have to choose of the kind of properties you are running after. So one point that is very important is what is the purpose of my classification. I can do many different classifications here outside. I can classify according to colors. I can classify according to size. I can classify according to how I am using what is outside there. I can classify according to so many goals. If you look at what is kids or people's mind about biodiversity as an example, if you look at what people have in mind, all of us we have three goals in our mind when we speak about nature. We have a goal of utility, and some words were created for that. For instance, fish. Fish is what you get with a certain techniques of having access to organisms into water. You can speak about what organisms do, or you can speak about what organisms have. And I trust me, you won't have the same classification if you look at what they do and if you look at what they have. A fly flies by definition. It's a name. Mouche vole. A fly flies. A duck flies. But if you look at the structure with which each of them fly, they really don't look like each other. It's very different structures here and here. What I call wing is really structurally completely different in the two organisms. The pitfall in zoology is to have called that wing. We should have never done that. I mean, zoology at a certain period of its time, specifically at the antiquity, created some names to designate part of the organisms according to what they do, not to how they are constructed. And it is a pity that we call that a wing, and that a wing, structurally, it has nothing to do. Unless you go down to the cells at the scale of cells, also you will have something comparable. But if you are not at the scale of cells, macroscopic scale, those two structures have nothing to do. And zoology have called that wings. This is a pity, actually. We should have named parts according to their structures, not according to their function. And structures and function do not overlap always each other. If you have a classification about structure and a classification about function, you will obtain exactly that kind of thing. Inconsistency. So you have to choose. If you don't want inconsistency, you have to choose between structure. I'm speaking about biodiversity now. For biodiversity, you have to distinguish concepts speaking about functions and concepts speaking about structures. Phytoplankton, for instance, is a group that was made to designate all the organisms in the pelagic realm that produced photosynthesis. It has some consistency if you want to explain the cycles of carbon dioxide around the Earth. Okay, it's a functional box that is efficient for that. But if you look at what they have, this box is completely heterogeneous. Some part of the phytoplankton is related to animals that do not do, organisms that do not do any photosynthesis, and other parts are related to living plants, terrestrial plants. Another part is related to something else. It's completely heterogeneous. Livestock is a utilitarian concept. It can have some functional consistency if you look at the cycle of methane, the gas. But according to systematics, it has nothing to do with systematics. So my discourse is not to eradicate or is not to suppress the other goals than the one of systematics. My discourse is just to say that we have to be conscious of the use we are doing of the concepts we are using. Each word or concept is legitimate as soon as you use it into the concept for which it was made. Don't say actinopterygians in the fish market. You will be ridiculous. And so don't say fish in a zoology lab. You will be ridiculous. You know what I mean? So you can use both words, but in their context. So what is in systematics, what the classification is made for? This is the 13th chapter of the first edition of Charles Darwin, Origin of Species. The natural system of classification is founded on descent with modification. The characters which naturalists consider as showing the true affinity between any two or more species are those which have been inherited from a common parent. So descent is about ancestors, common parents. It's for those of you that are native English speakers, there is no problems about that. But for French-speaking people, it's really difficult to understand, because for French, descendants is the offspring, is not the ancestors. So you don't understand the text. If you translate descent by descendants, which Raymond Barbier, the main translator of Darwin, did, you don't understand the text. You can't classify organisms according to their descendants because the offspring is not yet here. So he has a weird idea, this Charles Darwin, you know. Now, the translation is really a sensitive topic in history of science. So far, all true classification is genealogical. Darwin is proposing a program for making sense of the diversity of life. Classification is about speaking about the origins of, it's about ontology. It's about speaking about the origin of first of all, what it is, and the origin of of this. So it is a program for classification. It's a classificatory program. Community of descent is a hidden bond which naturalists have unconsciously seeking, and not some unknown plan of creation. So in this text, you have a kind of revolution. It's not the only one that Darwin did, but this is one of them. He's making an allusion to linear classification here. There is no creation anymore, not because Darwin wants to provoke religions, it's just because the independence of science in explaining nature with natural phenomena. And genealogy is a natural phenomenon for Darwin. It's just an independence from metaphysic considerations. It's not about provoking religions. And it's also because there is some kind of heritage in the classifications from the times of Linnaeus, as I said earlier. So if you look at two organisms today, those layers, horizontal layers, are layers of time, at different scales, whatever the scale. The principle is that when you take two organisms today, at one moment or another, it must be related in terms of genealogy. You must find somewhere a common ancestor. I won't explain further what is in this direction, but I don't have the time to that. But for that moment, just keep in mind that this theoretical tree of life is becomes a classificatory program starting from that moment. So this is the reason why we classify according to what they have in common, those organisms. This is what they have is, as I said, it's witnessing the common ancestors. It is an example of a clear classificatory program. When I say for having a good classification, you need a good classificatory and explicit classificatory program. What is a property you want to reflect through your classification? The program was set by Darwin, but Darwin didn't have the method to do that. So during 1 century, between 1859 to 1950, classifications were in between, if I could say. They tried to reflect genealogy, but they couldn't really do that. They couldn't do that so efficiently as with Hennig. Hennig in 1950 created the method to produce a classification here that directly reflects common ancestry. The nested sets are created according to a phylogenetic reconstruction. This school of thinking is named phylogenetic systematics. Systematic phylogenetic, it's not surprising, systematics is the science of classification, and phylogenetics, it's classification based on phylogeny. Just to say that it's not because Darwin set the program that he's able himself to do that. He's very humble about that. He says, I'm not sure that we will be able to reflect the past genealogy, but we have to try. He's very precautious about that. But Hennig finds a method to do that. I won't explain you Hennig's method today, but just to let you know that it produced stuff like that, what we call a phylogenetic tree, where if you put a name on each node of the tree, on each branch, you have a phylogenetic classification. There is a complete collinearity between the boxes and the tree. There is no partial overlaps, I showed you before. Normally, it is what we do. Some groups of the past, some Linnean groups, were saved by this system, paradoxically. For instance, birds. Linnaeus created the class aves in Latin, meaning birds. And it's a fact that the characters that define the birds were good phylogenetic characters. So birds were preserved, the box birds was preserved in this system. It was not created until into this system, but it was preserved in system. The same for mammals. For instance, for fish, it was a different situation. For fish, Linnaeus used the concept of fish, but this concept is completely exploded into that school of classification. A trout is more related to you than it is to the shark. You have to know that. You share many bones with the trout, and you and the trout don't share those bones with the shark. Actually, a shark have no bones. And a shark is more related to you than it is to a lamprey. So you understand that what we call fish has nothing to do with phylogeny. Okay, so fish has disappeared from the modern zoological classifications. Invertebrates have disappeared too. A starfish is more related to you than it is to a snail or a worm. So invertebrates have disappeared also. It's not surprising because it was based on a negative property. So what we call a taxon in biology is a virtual box that we consider through time. Vertically, you have time here. You have common ancestry here. We have this common ancestry documented by an exclusive shared character. Each character is a hole in the pelvis, and it defines dinosaurs, for instance. You have dinosaurs from the Triassic times, dinosaurs from the Jurassic times, dinosaurs from the Cretaceous times, and dinosaurs from today. Because you have to consider that birds have kept these characters, and it's not a scoop today to say that birds are dinosaurs. So dinosaurs don't have disappeared. So virtual boxes that are nested into each other and considered through time. Obviously, there were no birds during the Triassic times, but starting from the Jurassic, you find birds. Birds defined by certain kind of feathers. The heritage we have to deal with, specifically in natural history. I will be back on that later on. If you look at old books, you can find this kind of figure with bubbles like that. It is interesting to me to know how many of you have seen those kind of figures in books already. Known? Most of you are not biologists, so maybe you don't look at the books, but those figures. No, anyway, it's not a problem. Those figures are. If you clearly look at the meaning of this figure, you have time here, and you have ancestor-descendant relationship between classes, the class of birds and the class of reptiles. Birds descend from reptiles. Reptiles descend from amphibians. Amphibians descend from fish, and so on. When I was at school, this scheme was taught to me. It's weird that I'm just telling you that boxes are in our mind. There outside, there are no birds. They are just individuals. Relationship between ancestors and descendants is not about classes about boxes. It's about individuals. So I'm confusing the property of the content and the property of the box. Birds do not descend from reptiles. Birds are reptiles. Because boxes are nested into each other, they do not descend from each other. The ancestor-descendant relationship is a matter of contents. It's a property between individuals. So the correct scheme that is recombining evolution and classification is to make clearly the difference between the boxes that are nested into each other and the ancestor-descendant that is a property of the individuals. We make the difference between genealogy and the phylogeny. Genealogy is a scheme where you are able to identify the individual identity of the ancestor and the descendant. Phylogeny is a scheme you are producing when you don't have genealogy anymore. It looks paradoxic, but phylogeny is about who is closely related to whom. Genealogy is about who is descending from whom. And you don't have access to the second one. You only have access to the first one. A trout is more related to you than from a shark. It is phylogeny. Humans descend from sharks or from trouts. It's not phylogeny. First, it's wrong, but second, it's not about phylogeny. It's about genealogy, purely speaking. So here, we took the boxes as if they were real. And remember, I told you that Ernst Mayr produced a kind of taxonomic realism. Do you remember that? Remember, in the table a few hours before, species were real for Ernst Mayr. And there were also some degree of taxonomic realism from Ernst Mayr when they defended in 1974. He himself said that we would have never created reptiles if there were no birds to learn to fly. This sentence is incredible. He's just saying that reptiles are not defined from themselves. They are defined because they are cut to part of descendants that have learned to fly, the birds. And looking at that figure, taxonomic realism is illustrated by the fact that a class is descending from another class. Here, there is no taxonomic realism. We are looking at mutual relationships, not whom is descending from whom, but who is more closely related to whom. Everyone is at the same level, you know. And we are looking at common features, and starting from common features, we are creating nested sets based on common features. But the sets are not descending from each other, they are nested into each other. So it was about a single purpose. If you run after several, we have a French expression. If you run about 5 rabbits, we get none of them. If you want to get a rabbit, run after one, only one. This is the message. We need to produce complete groups. Why do you produce a group when you leave entities that have the property and you don't put it in a group? Example from natural history, obviously, fishes, for instance. All fishes have a skull. If you look back at the origin of fishes, this is the moment you have the rise of the skull in vertebrates. All fishes have skulls. So you could say, okay, all fish are defined by the sharing of the skull. But by doing that, you leave organisms with a skull that you don't put into fishes. So it's an inconsistency of your classification. Why do you produce a group based on a shared property while you are leaving stuff with that property outside? And this is what we did in the past. The old definition of reptiles. Okay, reptiles were defined by the sharing of scales, keratin scales. But you have keratin scales on the legs of birds and you don't put birds on reptiles. In the old classifications, the one I have learned at school. You can say reptiles are also defined by the sharing of the membrane that makes a kind of sac into which the embryo is developing, the amniotic sac. Okay, birds have the amniotic sac into their eggs, and we don't put birds into reptiles. Classically, I mean. Today we do it, but at that time, no. Mammals do have the amnios, and we don't put mammals into reptiles. So why do you are defining a group by leaving stuff having the characteristics of the group outside? Same for fishes. As I said, if you say that we have a skull, fishes have skull, we leave outside fishes organisms that do have skulls. Oh, you can see by this figure how heterogeneous fishes are. A trout here is more, it's not a trout, but anyway, the trout is here. It's more related to you than to a shark. You have the bones, but the shark is more related to you than it is to a lamprey, and so on. And a dipnoan is more related to you than it is from a trout. We have the alveoles in the lungs. Anyway. Sometimes during the 20th century, we did with Mayer's and synthetic theory of evolution, we try to run after different properties. Phylogeny, but also ecological niches. And as I said, if you mix what they do and what they have, you can have a consistent classification. Here you have an expression of this contradiction, the time here vertically, and the divergence, the anatomical divergence here in the horizontal arrow. You're looking from the outside, a crocodile looks like a lizard. And you could say, okay, I do reptiles here. And birds don't look like a crocodile, very different than a crocodile from the outside. The problem is if you are looking inside, you will have some surprise. Crocodiles and birds do have both an internal anatomy, many characters shared in the internal anatomy. 77 osteological characters, for instance. Let me give you one of them. A fenestra in the mandibula here you find exclusively in today's nature, exclusively shared by crocodiles and birds. A muscular formation of the esophagus that we call a gésier, gizzard, is shared by the crocodile and the birds, and so on. So internally, the crocodile has more to do with birds than with the lizard. So this is the reason why there is a common ancestry here. If you classify according to adaptive jumps, as we said at the time in the 20th century, mid 20th century, adaptive jumps, there is a jump here because birds learn to fly, and it strongly impacted their anatomy. So this empty space here is a divergence of general similarity. And this is the reason why the evolutionary school of classification maintained reptiles in the old sense excluded from birds, or birds excluded from the reptiles, in spite of the fact that crocodiles and birds shared common ancestors. So if you look at the old program of classification, the one of Meyer School, you maintain reptiles here and you put birds here. And if you look at phylogenetic classification, you have archosaurs here because you have common ancestry here between the crocodile and the bird, and you have lepidosaurs there. So these two schools of classification obviously did not end up with comparable classifications. It's a matter of choosing the goal of your classification. What are you trying to express through your classification? Major steps. There is many of us have produced epistemological criticism of this notion of major step of evolution. We don't know what is a major step of evolution. It's a retrospective importance given to the story of our lineage. The most popular major step of evolution is the way the tetrapods had access to land. And we call that la sortie des eaux en français, la sortie des eaux, the landing of tetrapods, if you can. But the expression in French is even worse. La sortie des eaux. It's biblical, you know. You have to go outside water. And the kids at the school ask the teacher, "Oh, you explained me that the fishes are adapted to their life into the water or into sea. What need could they have to go outside? They were well into the water." So this expression "sortie des eaux," going out of the water, it's a kind of stupid metaphor, because there was no impulse for any of these fish to go outside. It was the water that was retracting. You know what I mean? When you dry a fluvial system, when you dry a river, you force fish populations to resist to drying conditions, and generation after generation, you select progressively animals that are able to live into water when the river is full of water, and in dry conditions we have typically this kind of situation is in tropical rivers, Australia, Central Africa, and South America, where there are dipnoans. Actually, the three genera of dipnoans are in both continents, in all of these continents. So it's not going out water. It's a kind of, telling us storytelling. It's not going out water. It's water that is retiring. So the reason why the fish had to go out water, we can make some jokes about that. And we evolutionists have some stupid metaphors ourselves, some storytelling that is not compatible with what we understand from evolution of life. This guy imagined that Noé has some drank too much, you know, and he had to put fishes from the sea to the arch. I like that one. Great moments in evolution. Maybe some of you know Gary Larson. He's a famous drawer. Any lab has some cartoons of Gary Larson. Those fishes were playing baseball, and one of them sent the ball on the land, so they had to go out to pick up the ball. You know, or there are some more bizarre reasons to go outside water, but I won't enter into details here. More obviously, more for males. So, if you classify before evolution, you have this kind of figure. If you have evolution before classification, you have this kind of figure. Can you imagine the change of paradigm systematics have achieved during the last third of the 20th century? Henig's phylogenetic systematics jumped from this paradigm to this one. When I was young, when I entered the museum at Paris, I have been confronted into old school classificators like that. And epistemology is completely different. You can understand how different is it. You know, here you take the Linnaeus classes, and you are looking for evolution between classes that were created by a guy who didn't speak about evolution. There was no evolution for Linnaeus, you know. So they tried by adaptive jump to preserve Linnaeus classification into an evolutionary framework, which was a kind of bizarre construction. And this one is trying to make clear the objectives of classification and not to confuse the properties of the content and the properties of the box. And we couldn't understand each other. So there were old stupid guys and young stupid guys, you know what I mean. En français, il y avait les jeunes cons et les vieux cons. We couldn't understand each other. Because it was really in the pure sense of what the paradigm is. It was really a change of paradigm, a change of practice of classification. I will finish with a notion that is. I make it more specific on the properties for rational and efficient categories in science in general. I gave you examples about the science I know, what I'm practicing, but I would like to attract your attention about the degree of generality of these requirements. Information richness, hierarchical consistency, being clear on the purpose, and making complete groups. It's not so enigmatic. I mean, I had a long discussion with an anthropologist. He's dead now, Alain Testard. Alain Testard was classifying human societies, and he was classifying human societies according to their economical relationships. And he created incomplete groups, and he also created some group poubelle, trash bins. You know, the entities that do not enter the classification I am doing. Trash bin, is it clear? No, a sac poubelle. You put into a box the stuff that doesn't go in any of the group. So voilà. And so it was about the consistency of his classification. And to finish, back to biology, you would be maybe surprised or maybe amazed about the fact that a species is not real. I'm not provoking you. I mean, I would like to drive your attention about a permanent confusion in science between criteria to recognize and a definition. You have learned at school what a species is. A number of individuals that are able to reproduce themselves and give offspring, fertile offspring. This is not a definition. It is a criterion for assigning an individual to species 1, species 2, or species 3. It is assignation, the third operation I showed you first. You have two main criteria to be able to assign a given individual to boxes that are already made. Fecundity, interfecundity. Obviously, if this guy can make offspring with those ones, you will put them into the same species. And similarity, but similarity doesn't always work, but most of the time it works. But it is not a definition. With the problems we have in biology and the way we teach biology is always the same. We confuse the definition and the criterion for assignation. Chemistry never made this mistake. You know, in chemistry, if I'm defining sodium by giving you the number of protons and neutrons into the nucleus and the number of electrons, I will give you a definition of what sodium is. Natrium, sodium, anyway. No chemist will confuse that definition of sodium with the parameters I need to know that in salt there is sodium in salt. In biology, we always making the confusion. I don't know why, but we do it. We confuse the criteria with the definition. The definition is something different. The definition is not operational. Definition is about ontology. What we call a species is the flow of generation that makes babies together, okay. While the flow is not divided. When it gets divided, we are obliged to change a name by definition, by convention. So what we document when we say, oh, a new species appeared, what we document actually is a barrier of reproduction here. But the definition by itself is a generation flow, undivided generation flow. Obviously separated from the other, otherwise it would be the same generation flow. Okay. What is the main difference between criteria for assignation and definition? The definition here is located into the depths of time, which is very, very important in biology. When I'm saying an undivided generation flow, I am taking the depth of time into account, which is the most important difference here. When I'm practicing the assignation, I don't need the depth of time. It's just now. It's just being as Ernst Mayr was in the thin layer of time, you know. So we always meet this confusion, and I will conclude by saying that if I'm speaking as a biologist, I would say that as a biologist we cannot ignore the depth of time, because what we have to deal with, objects we have to deal with, are historical objects. Thank you.